Okay, welcome to the Global NPO Coalition on FATF's webinar, Nonprofits Are No Longer Particularly Vulnerable, What's Next? And thanks to all of you for taking the time to participate. We are presenting this webinar to describe the significant changes the Financial Action Task Force made to its Recommendation 8 on government anti-terrorist financing regulation of nonprofits last June. FATF also revised the interpretive note that provides more detail on how countries should implement it. The positive changes made in June capped 4 years of effort by NPOs that began with Statewatch's 2012 report that brought FATF to the attention of civil society. We learned that this obscure task force, organized by 35 states, created anti-money laundering standards that almost every country seeks to comply with. After 9/11, anti-terrorist financing was added to FATF's agenda, including Recommendation 8 on nonprofits. The previous version of Recommendation 8 stated that nonprofits are particularly vulnerable to terrorist abuse, despite lack of evidence that this is the case. Statewatch report demonstrated implementation of Recommendation 8 led to restrictions and overregulation of civil society in many of the 160 countries it examined. In some cases, deliberate attempts to restrict civil society were made. In others, it was more an attempt to get a good rating from FATF. With the changes in June of this year, following revision in 2015 of the Best Practices paper and the Typology report, FATF has established a new framework that is much more civil society friendly. It emphasizes that any government regulation must be risk-based, proportionate, protect legitimate nonprofits, and be consistent with international human rights and humanitarian law. But we still have more work to do, both at FATF and in our home countries, to make sure these principles are implemented. The expert speakers today will follow and describe the changes that were made and the implications, as well as the next steps we need to take. They are Hannah Surmatz from the European Foundation Center, Kate McGran from Norwegian Refugee Council, and Vanya Skoric from the European Center for Not-for-Profit Law. And my co-chair, Leah Van Breckhoven from the Human Security Collective, will moderate the question and answer session. So thank you again for participating, and we look forward to the follow-up work with you over the coming months and year. Hannah, please begin.
Yes, thank you, Kay, for the introduction, and welcome everybody on board for this webinar. It has been indeed a very successful summer and a June FATF plenary because decisions were taken in our favor, and we've been pushing for some time to get the Recommendation 8 changed. Now, if you look at the rationale for the change of the Recommendation 8, according to the Financial Action Task Force, they are giving the following arguments. The NPO sector and the threat environment has changed. Well, we have seen more terrorist attacks, obviously, in the past, but we've also seen more research undertaken on who is actually funding and financing terrorism, and also some research undertaken of how much the NPO sector is actually abused. So indeed, there were two recent papers issued by the Financial Action Task Force, which is in 2014, the Typologies report, and in 2015, a revised best practice paper. The Typologies report reviews 100 cases of abuse of the NPO sector and drafts a typology around this. So indeed, there is a common agreement and acknowledgement that the NPO sector, which is composed of millions of NPOs, that abuse is rare. It does happen, but it is rare. In the revised best practice paper, which is giving good practice of how to implement the Recommendation 8 by governments, it has changed significantly, taking a risk-based approach with the aim that only those NPOs at risk would need to be covered by measures to counter the financing of terrorism. And indeed, the revised standard, which we now have, aims to ensure that the implementation of the Recommendation 8 is in line with this risk-based approach, and it does not disrupt and discourage legitimate NPO activity. So that indeed is an acknowledgement that the vast majority of NPOs engage in legitimate activities, and cases of abuse are rare, and hence it has to be a risk-based approach. Now, I would like us all to take the time to read the new Recommendation 8 on NPOs, given that it's taken some time for the recommendation to change, and we should take the time to celebrate indeed that the wording has changed. So the new Recommendation 8 now says that countries should review the adequacy of laws and regulations that relate to non-profit organizations which the country has identified as being vulnerable to terrorist financing abuse. Countries should apply focused and proportionate measures in line with the risk-based approach to such non-profit organizations to protect them from terrorist financing abuse. And if we now look at this versus the old Recommendation 8 on NPOs, I would also like us to take the time to read that indeed the old version said countries should review the adequacy of laws and regulations that relate to entities that can be abused for the financing of terrorism. Non-profit organizations are particularly vulnerable, and countries should ensure that they cannot be misused. So we see that indeed the red highlighted wording here, which was singling out the NPO sector as a whole to be particularly vulnerable, that this has gone. And this is indeed a very positive development, because it singled out our whole entire sector, and as I mentioned earlier, indeed abuse cases are rare, and the wording has led to over-regulation and to some extent inappropriate restrictions on NPOs. We've seen that governments have used the Recommendation 8 to introduce significant barriers and to do a broad brush on the entire NPO sector without taking a thorough analysis. If you could move to the second slide. So the cases of overregulation and inappropriate restrictions were also brought now to the attention of the Financial Action Task Force and of the attention to some governments. And indeed, NPOs around the world have been stressing the need to stop singling out the NPO sector. So indeed, we clearly welcome this change to the Recommendation 8, and we look back to a constructive engagement also with the Financial Action Task Force in changing the wording of the Recommendation 8. Now, I would like to move on to some further changes with regard to the Recommendation 8 and the Recommendation 8 interpretative note. And if we move to this next slide, as I have said earlier, it is now for governments to take a risk-based approach. And I would like to analyze a little bit, what does this mean? A risk-based approach means the following, that the countries should first identify which organizations fall within the FATF definition of NPOs. And then they should identify from these NPOs which of those are vulnerable to potentially to terrorism financing abuse. And that is a subset of the NPOs. And as a third step, then countries should review the adequacy of measures, laws and regulation that relate to this subset. And measures should then be focused, targeted and proportionate in line with this risk-based approach. Now that may sound a little bit technical, so I would like to move to the next slide to illustrate a little bit more of how we come to this kind of subset of NPOs that is likely to be at risk. So if you look at the green section, that's basically the entire NPO universe. And then you move up to those NPOs as defined by the FATF, and only those should be covered by the FATF Recommendation 8. And under this definition, it is understood a legal person or arrangement or organization that preliminarily engages in raising or dispersing funds for purposes such as charitable, religious, cultural, educational, social, or fraternal purposes, or for the carrying out of other types of good works. So this is the NPOs which are covered by the FATF regulation. But then the governments would need to look at these NPOs and then decide which one of those are potentially likely to be at risk of terrorist financing abuse. And this kind of assessment of which NPOs are potentially at risk, that is of course the critical questions of how do countries go about identifying those to be potentially at risk. And here indeed the next slide please. The standard itself is not prescriptive, so the country is in a way free to do its own national risk assessment. It could do it as a separate risk assessment or as a standalone exercise or as part of its national general risk assessment. So what the Recommendation 8 interpretive note says is that it doesn't have to be a written product. So the countries are relatively free to make their own assessment of and definition of the subset of NPOs which the country then considers to be at potentially higher risk for abuse for the financing of terrorism. And here we may have to review indeed how potentially an assessment of a country and the definition of the subset can be questioned if there is no written product. This may be difficult then to understand how the country went about defining this subset of NPOs. If you look at the Interpretative 8 para 5, you see that there are some features and types of NPOs which by virtue of their activities or characteristics are likely to be at risks, and the nature of threats posed by terrorist entities to NPOs. Now, I think that's my initial take, is that some of these words will need to be kind of further defined, and indeed we will see that governments will now start defining the subset of NPOs, and there might be need for further guidance. There is already a bit of guidance, but I think that's one of the areas where we will see that we will need to engage also with FATF and with the governments at national level to see how we can, how the countries have clear guidance in terms of defining the subset that is considered at risk. Now, the NPO coalition had asked initially for this kind of subset to be included in the glossary, because the wording of the recommendation interpretive note as it is not entirely 100% clear. I mean, that's the way we've been interpreting it, and that's the way the FATF Secretariat had also been giving us reassurance that this is indeed the way to interpret the subset of NPOs and that countries should undertake this risk-based approach. But we would have recommended for this definition of the subset to be included in the glossary. Now, that is something that we may want to discuss with the Financial Action Task Force in the future, whether indeed there is a possibility to include that into the glossary. The next point I wanted to raise is indeed the targeted risk-based supervision and monitoring that is recommended according to the Recommendation 8 interpretative note. Now, this is also now very clear that indeed the supervision and monitoring must only be applied to those NPOs identified at risk for terrorism financing abuse, so only to the subset of NPOs. There is in the Recommendation 8 a listing of examples in the section 6b of potential measures that could be undertaken, and we have been arguing as the NPO coalition that we find a listing a bit unfortunate, since it could be misunderstood by governments as a checklist approach. whereas clearly this is now not the intention, because the new wording says that measures could be chosen from the list of examples. So we hope that this is reassurance enough for us to be clear that these are only examples, but nonetheless there may be still countries who would consider this a checklist and who would consider that well, if we do go with the checklist approach and introduce all measures listed here, that this would be the best implementation possible. So here I think again we will have to work at the national level as well to ensure that this is just an exemplary list and not a checklist. Clearly this section on the supervision and monitoring also stresses again that the governments have to do as a first step a review of existing regulatory or other measures if they do not potentially already address the risk, the identified risk. And here it's a clear reference also not only to hard law regulations but also to potentially soft law approaches. So indeed that's also something where NPOs may engage then with the national legislators to ensure that existing measures are reviewed carefully and looked at if they are not already addressing the risk, because indeed if they do address the risk, there is not even need for any additional measures. So I think I stop here, and if there are any questions around these issues or later in the debate we can come back to this, and then we will look now into some more details around the recommendation interpretive note. And I pass back to Kate or Leah.
Hi, this is Kate. Thank you very much for those very useful introductions and explanatory notes to start the discussion. So good afternoon to everyone. It's a pleasure to join you on this webinar, or good morning to those on the other side of the Atlantic Ocean. So as Hannah said there, I'm just going to look into the text of the interpretive note in a little bit more detail. And I'm going to just discuss a little bit the term beneficiary and how it is defined by the FATF, and some of the aspects of impact around some of the text in the interpretive note. So let me begin by just looking at the definition of beneficiary. In the revised interpretive note, June 2016, the definition remains unchanged. Just to draw your attention to a few parts of this, the definition states that the term beneficiaries refers to those natural persons or groups of natural persons who receive charitable, humanitarian, or other types of assistance through the services of a non-profit organization. The terminology natural persons remains here from the previous version of the interpretive note, and it seems to make the distinction between individual beneficiaries and groups of beneficiaries. And I just leave you with that thought because it's relevant to some of the further text in the interpretive note. Moving to another aspect. So I want to capture one particular point of the interpretive note, that there's many aspects which are very interesting to discuss, but I want to capture the aspects in section C of the interpretive note part 6, which looks at targeted risk-based supervision or monitoring of non-profit organizations. So the text here states that non-profit organizations could be required to take reasonable measures to confirm the identity, credentials, and good standing of beneficiaries and associate non-profit organizations, and that they are not involved with and or using the charitable funds to support terrorists or terrorist organizations. This is a slight change from earlier texts, which some will know as the Know Your Beneficiaries and Associate NPOs rule. And that previous text stated that NPOs should make, quote, best efforts to confirm the identity, credentials, and good standing of their beneficiaries and associate nonprofit organizations. So here you'll see on the screen that there's a few elements of this quote which I have highlighted. So it's important to look at these aspects for a few reasons, notably just to have more clarity on what they could or might not mean. Firstly, the term reasonable measures is not explicitly defined by the FATF, and therefore in terms of how this can be interpreted by states remains quite open in how a state may define what a reasonable measure actually is. But there's no specific definition from the FATF on what a reasonable measure is that should be taken by an NPO. The term "they are not involved with and or using the charitable funds to support terrorists or terrorist organizations" is also an important point which has come up in discussions between the NPO coalition and the FATF. The reason that this has come up in discussion is around what does it mean? What does not involved with terrorists or terrorist associations mean? What does it mean to be involved with a terrorist? Does this refer to, for example, could this refer to a beneficiary with genuine humanitarian needs but happens to be the family member or a neighbor of a terrorist? Of course, for those of us who are implementing humanitarian programs, as NRC and many other organizations are, such terminology could be in tension with the humanitarian principle of impartiality. Humanitarian organizations are delivering humanitarian assistance on the basis of needs alone and according to the humanitarian principles. So this particular part of text is also a little bit unclear. And it's important for humanitarian organizations, I think, to consider that. International humanitarian law also requires that aid be given on the basis of needs alone. This particular part of the interpretive note, it remains unclear and it's open for interpretation about how or with whom the information that is requested to be taken here would be shared. So it's not clear, and there is no specific explicit guidance on if an NPO should gather this information and retain it confidentially, and then it is up to an organization to make a decision around that, or if a state may actually require to have that information. This is an important point. Because sharing information regarding the identity, credentials, and quote, good standing of beneficiaries externally it is a red line for a lot of humanitarian organizations. But again, this all comes down to how this text is interpreted at state level. On a practical level speaking, outside of the international humanitarian law and principles and the various aspects I've just mentioned, it would also be extremely difficult, if not impossible, to gather reams of information and do reams of background checks in the environment of a massive emergency response. Doing extensive background checks would require a lot of resources and time if an organization accepted to do it in the first place, and therefore could actually potentially impede or delay the delivery of assistance, which would be very difficult, of course, for the whole response. The term preceding that, which is beneficiaries and associate NPOs, the fact that beneficiaries, the word beneficiaries is followed by the words associate NPOs suggests that the reasonable measures would be required to be taken on individuals and organizations rather than just organizations. And if we could just flip to the next slide, please. There is a footnote in this part, in section C of the interpretive note, which does add that, quote, this does not mean that non-profit organizations are expected to identify each specific individual, as such a requirement would not always be possible and would, in some instances, impede the ability of non-profit organizations to provide much needed services. So this particular footnote is definitely a very welcome footnote, and definitely provides a disclaimer that confirmation of the identity and credentials and good standing of beneficiaries would not always be possible. So the NPO coalition definitely, I think, welcomes this. However, it is not quite clear when it would apply and when it would not apply. So again, it's a little bit open for interpretation by each state. Just moving on to the next part of what I'm going to look at, which is a little bit around the potential impact of the FATF recommendations on NPO work. So there's quite a lot of there's some documentation which has been previously published around the impact of FATF recommendation 8 on states. And through the mutual evaluation processes at state level, states' levels of compliance with FATF regulations are recorded, and states are asked to either amend their processes in line with FATF regulations, or if they are given a record of non-compliance, or they are given a record of compliance. And certainly I would draw your attention, rather than go into each specific example, I would draw your attention to the work done by Ben Hayes in 2012, which goes through some specific examples of where states with low levels of compliance with FATF regulations have adapted their processes and that impacts on non-profit organizations, and those who were already were given a rate of compliance with FATF regulations, and how that has also impacted non-profit organizations. But I would just like here to look at the impact on financial services related to non-profit organizations, which I think is certainly a very pertinent and a very real-life, everyday challenge for a lot of organizations, and particularly, unfortunately, for frontline national organizations and Muslim organizations in particular. There's no getting away from the fact that financial institutions are a lifeline for humanitarian actors, and the non-profit sector does rely on the international banking sector to receive funding from governments, from donors, from private donors, and relies on that same banking sector to distribute those funds to affiliate offices in various areas of operation. So it is as I say, it is a lifeline, and increasingly strict measures to control financial transactions have been increasingly imposed, I guess, since 2001. And one of the aspects influencing, not the only, but one of the aspects influencing this is the FATF and its regulations. With regards to banks, the NPO sector is unfortunately it is high risk and not necessarily high profit either. There has been quite some work done on the impacts on the Muslim NGO sector in particular, and the impact that these banking regulations have had. When this has been covered, I would recommend the Humanitarian Policy Group work on this, where they have looked at the difficulties for NPOs to open bank accounts and to access financial services and to transfer funds to areas of operation. NRC has also conducted a lot of extensive work into the impact of counterterrorism and has noted the impact of FATF regulations as well, and has an example and had many interviews on this subject in 2013, where it was also found that some banks have said that they will simply not transfer funds to Muslim NGOs because of the associated risks. This is not the rule. This is just an example of the difficulties that are had. There is, needless to say, a disruption to the finance flow, and this disruption to finance flow thus has an impact on humanitarian activities. Lack of access to financial services means lack of access to capital, and not being able to purchase, to pay salaries, not being able to deliver assistance, or delivering assistance on a delayed time schedule. So these are not these are some very real-time impacts of how a variety of legislation can lead to us. And then I want to also just look at the intersection with humanitarian trends. So I'm sure many of you are familiar with the very recent World Humanitarian Summit. And for those who are engaged with us, you might also be very aware that one of the major, I guess, outcomes of the World Humanitarian Summit was the Grand Bargain. And the Grand Bargain covers 10 work streams, but 2 of those work streams relate to cash and localization. And humanitarian actors, donors, UN agencies, national, international NGOs have come together, and there is an endorsement for increasing cash programming at field level. And there is also an endorsement for improving and increasing localization as well in humanitarian response in particular, but across the board also in development. And the question is, if there are increasing requirements on the NPO sector, particularly with relation to financial services, how does this square with moving forward with the cash and localization agenda? So it's, I don't have the answer to that, but it's definitely an important question to raise. So that brings me to my next slide. Thank you very much. Yeah, so just to highlight that through NRC's work and the work of a lot of organizations, and I would also refer to the work that that Harvard Law School have also done on some of these topics, and members here today. But the impact of measures related to counterterrorism and countering terrorist financing that we have found through our research is excessive risk aversion by humanitarian actors, notably around a lack of clarity about state regulations, which may lead some organizations to mitigate risk by self-imposed over-regulation. For example, choosing not to operate in some areas due to uncertainty about measures at state level or otherwise. This in turn, of course, leads to reduced needs-based assistance. So if organizations are withholding assistance from certain beneficiaries linked with or residing in areas controlled by terrorists. And this links back to what I mentioned earlier about association with terrorist groups. What does that mean? If you were in the same area, what does it mean to be associated with a terrorist group? And this means that that we are not, if this does indeed happen, that assistance is not being provided on needs alone. In terms of what I mentioned at the start also about what does this text mean about taking reasonable measures to confirm the identity, credentials and good standing of beneficiaries, depending on how that could be interpreted, there is also a risk to compromising the privacy of staff or partner organizations if organizations go down that route. And depending on the terms of the requirements to confirm the identity and good standing of beneficiaries and NGO partners, yeah, remains to be seen how this can be interpreted. And then finally, there is of course a concern over the prosecution of humanitarian actors. So this is also linked to the excessive risk aversion by humanitarian actors, but without clarity about what regulations exist or how regulations are to be interpreted, then there can remain, even though there are extremely limited examples of prosecution to date, it's important to still to remember these points and to acknowledge that there is concern over prosecution of humanitarian actors related to potential violation of measures. So that is my last slide. I'll look forward to questions at the end, and I will hand over now to Vanya. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and good afternoon and good morning to all listening in. I'm very happy to be joining this webinar and later on discussion. And many thanks to Hannah and Kate for excellent overview of what these revisions have brought us and what are some of the implications in practice and what we will face. As we heard, we have many things to celebrate in the new revisions. However, some issues and some definitions or provisions did remain unclear. And now the big question is how to translate all these positive revisions into the practice and into good implementation, and how to avoid some of the unclear or ambiguous language trap us still under the closing space. So if we can start with our slides, Our goal, I think we can all agree that our goal is to implement these standards uniformly and consistently with human rights and international humanitarian law obligations. And to achieve this, we really need to look at what are the processes happening on different levels. What is happening at the FATF level, what is happening at the level of the FATF-style regional bodies that are implementing the same standards, methodology, and policies as FATF, and there's 7 of them across the world for different regions. And of course, maybe most importantly, what is happening now on national level implementation. And what we are looking into is influencing first the preparations for the implementation, and that would be all the research, background research that is being done, policy that is being developed, guidance, possible trainings and education that is being done, and this is mostly done on FATF and FATF-style bodies level. Then on national level, we have to look at the risk assessment process of the non-profit sector, but also of the country in general. The process of reviewing the laws and the regulations that regulate non-profit sector, and of course any development of risk mitigation measures by the country itself. And then the next process we have to closely look at is the mutual country evaluations that are done by FATF or FATF-style regional bodies, depending on which country is in question. So these are the processes that we are looking at, and we are already influencing, and we have already influenced the first stage, the preparation stage. We already influenced the policy and the standards and some of the guidance. If you remember the best practice paper, we already did the influence here. However, we now really need to turn on the risk assessment process and country evaluation processes. I need to move on with the next slide. As I mentioned, the 3 levels that we are looking at. On global level, there is this policy making body, FATF, and standard setting body. They also decide on methodology that is going to be used for all the mentioned processes. Then in the middle, there is a regional level, the FATF-style regional bodies that were kind of out of sight for a while because they were not really policy setting, but now they really come into play with the implementation phase. And of course, on the country level, we really need to look at both national level government and national level civil society organizations. Next, please. So what is happening on the global level? As I mentioned, setting the policy and methodology, we are looking at possible additional requests for guidance and training of the evaluators. We know that the FATF has just recently established the TRAIN Center for Research and Education in South Korea, and we are looking forward to seeing how this center can maybe help influence other processes on regional and country level to really implement the standards as they were envisaged and in line with human rights and humanitarian law. As an example, we are already organizing joint workshops with FATF and meetings between governments, non-profit sector, and FATF. There will be one next week in London where we will discuss the mutual evaluation process and how this can be enhanced in favor of engaging more non-profit sector and really implementing the standards under the new revised text. We have mentioned already there is a need for more clearance and guidance on NPO subset definition, and we will definitely try to explore different avenues how this can be achieved, because we do not want to see different countries implementing this definition differently. And of course, we want to explore, is there any possibility to enhance or in some way improve the training of the evaluators that come into the country and evaluate the compliance with the recommendation 8? Can they be maybe sensitized more to really look for the subset that needs to be proportionately targeted? And can they be also more informed about possible negative impacts of recommendation 8 on civil society? Then on regional level, as I mentioned, we have FATF regional style bodies. they are tasked with preparation of evaluators also, and can as well provide guidance and education, both for countries and for evaluators. Now, as I mentioned, we did not look at those more closely until now, and there is more research needed on how they operate and what we can do to really engage in dialogue with them more. We did check a little bit their website, and the worrying trend that I, for example, caught was there is a lack of translation of major FATF documents, Recommendation 8, revised best practice paper, revised interpretive notes, lack of translation into local languages. For example, if you look at the Latin America FATF regional style body, GAFILAT, there is very little material translated in Spanish. And when we looked at the specific country reports, evaluation reports from 16 countries that are members of GAFILAT, we found that 11 of them were scored non-compliant on Recommendation 8 on the last evaluation report, and 5 of them only partially compliant with Recommendation 8. Now, this is immediate red light for potentially over-regulating the sector when you know that there is such a low score on the Recommendation 8 and the upcoming evaluation approaching, and the country will probably, most probably, go into additional legislative measures to try to overcome this low scoring. Now, several of these countries are up for evaluation in 2017, so we are looking closely what will be the examples and how the evaluators will now score the countries based on the new revised Recommendation 8 and interpretive note. And then finally, when you go to the national level, we mentioned already how the subset of NPOs needs to be clearly and more clearly defined. On the country level, there are really 4 processes, 4 steps that need to take place in order to implement the Recommendation 8 appropriately. One is to conduct a risk assessment of the non-profit sector that identifies the possibilities of abuse for this specific NPO subset, not the entire sector. The second one is to review the existing legislation, including soft law and self-regulatory mechanisms and programs, to see if they already maybe address the identified risks. Then the next step would be to take additional measures if the gaps are found in the existing legislation or self-regulatory mechanisms. However, these need to be proportionate to the risk and should not restrict the operations of non-profit organizations. And then finally, the result of these measures should again be consistent with obligations under international human rights and humanitarian law. Throughout all these steps, the countries are under the Recommendation 8 interpretive note under obligation to conduct outreach to non-profit sector about these processes. So in theory and ideally, all these processes should be done with engagement of the non-profit sector. Let's see next. Now, some of the examples of potentially looking more closely and working more closely on national level include building more knowledge to create more engagement of civil society through the risk assessment evaluation processes, to push back with knowledge and with increased capacity on counter-terrorism-driven legislation and measures. Some examples might include possibly conducting shadow evaluations by civil society sector in their own countries, if such opportunities arise, or to conduct shadow risk assessments of the non-profit sector if there is a need for such assessment, if there is no possibility to do it jointly with the government or to engage directly with the government. There were possibilities to directly input to the evaluators' teams the findings and concerns from non-profit sector about potential abuse or over-regulation of the, stemming from the Recommendation 8. We've had a couple of examples working on national level. For example, we are organizing workshops in the European countries. We had workshops in Sweden and Denmark where we prepared civil society organizations for the evaluation visits with the evaluators. And the recent examples in Sweden show that they really benefited actually from these preparations and the conversation and dialogue with the government beforehand, because they were able to show during the evaluation visit how their self-regulatory approaches mitigate the risks that the evaluators found, and hopefully this will mean there will be no additional regulation of the sector. We will see how this report turns out. In Switzerland, the non-profit sector did a quick risk assessment on their own. It was very basic, however, it did show the evaluators that the sector is aware of some of the risks. It did show the relevance of their own measures and self-regulatory initiatives, how they prevent any kind of abuse. And again, it might have deterred the report from recommending some additional measures to regulate the sector. In Kyrgyzstan now there will be evaluation upcoming in the late 2016, and their sector, their civil society, is about to do the national risk assessment on the non-profit organizations jointly with the government. So there is a will to do it jointly, and we will follow this process through with the engagement of our colleagues and partners from Human Security Collective, and hopefully get some insight on how this can be done and have some lessons to share when it's done. In the US, the organizations provided direct input, written input to the evaluators team, and maybe they can also share some more information on what they're planning to do and how they're planning to engage in the follow-up of the evaluators meeting and visit. So these are all possibilities. Not the entire wealth of ideas, and we welcome in the discussion, we welcome additional ideas, additional examples, what we as a sector can do on national, regional, and then global level to really ensure the implementation of these standards is our victory in the end. Thank you very much.
Okay, many thanks to Kay, to Hannah, to Kate and to Vanya for your good introduction and presentations. I would like now to invite those of you who participate in this webinar to pose your questions. And I already got some questions in which are actually for Hannah. So I would like to start off with the questions posed to Hannah, and we'll read them so you know what the person who asked the questions wants to know. He wants to know that Hannah said that the work at national level needs to ensure that 6B is an exemplary list and not a checklist. So the question is, how will the NPO coalition work at state level? Will it draw attention to exemplars? Will it focus on regional FATF bodies? And will it support capacity building work at the national level with a particular ministry? Hannah, could I hand you the mic?
Yes, sure, you can. So what I would like to say here is that indeed that's the exact wording, that these are just examples and it's not a checklist. So the suggestion is there that the NPO coalition would draft also some kind of additional kind of interpretation of how this should be read, and to use this as some material that could be used also at the national level for advocacy work. So if you look at the exact wording of the recommendation interpretative note, it is clear that it is just a list of examples. So that's something we have to stress, and we have to make clear that it is definitely not a checklist approach. And then, of course, it will be the challenging work in every country or in every region where there will be, of course, a risk assessment to potentially show that there are existing measures already in place that address the potential risk that have been identified. So in that sense, indeed, we can use, I think, the wording of the revised Recommendation 8 interpretive note and have to recall and repeat again that this is not a checklist, since we know that several governments have in the past tended to use such lists as simply to overregulate the sector. I mean, if we look at now the evaluation process and the way countries will be evaluated, we know that now there is this additional control of not just checking that the recommendation is implemented, but it's also an effectiveness check. And in this effectiveness check, there will also be possibilities to comment on cases of overregulation. So indeed, if you see that the checklist has been applied without having been linked to any concrete risk in the sector, then there is the argument on your side as NPOs to stress, well, this could be a case of clear overregulation because it's not a risk-based approach and the measure is not there to identify a specific identified risk. But I think the first step indeed is to provide some kind of additional kind of interpretation of the new version of Recommendation 8 and the interpretive note to make sure that it is not a checklist. These are examples, and as I said also in my presentation, we would have preferred, of course, that the any list would be taken out to avoid the risk of a checklist, because we believe that the listing of concrete examples would belong into the best practice paper, if at all, and not into the recommendation interpretive note itself. But here the decision was taken to keep certain examples, but really to say that these are examples only. So I hope this answers the question.
Okay. Thank you, Hannah. Then there was a follow-through question by the same person, and this he was referring to the pyramid you showed in relation to the risk-based approach and a non-profit organization. Perhaps, thank you. His question was, do you have a sense whether countries truly will see the sector as a pyramid, or will some continue to see it as the same or a rectangle? And do you, and I think he means the NPO coalition, have a list of countries that are great, good, bad? Hannah, you may answer, or anyone else from the presenters.
Yes, I think this is indeed a very crucial point to clarify and to be crystal clear that this is the best possible and the right interpretation of the Recommendation 8 interpretive note. As we said, the wording does lead some kind of questions for potentially a slightly different interpretation, and we'll try to develop some kind of additional clarifying material to make sure that indeed this is the way that there is the NPO universe. Then of course there are the NPOs that are defined and should be following under the FATF Recommendation 8 interpretive note, and then it is really this risk-based approach which clearly says that countries have to do their risk assessment and then decide which NPOs are potentially at risk for terrorist financing abuse. That indeed there is not so much clear guidance as to how governments will do this risk assessment, and as I said also earlier, it's problematic that the risk assessment doesn't have to be a written product, because of course if there is no written product it will be also difficult to challenge and to criticize the risk assessment. So this will require again an exchange between the NPO sector and the government when doing the risk assessment, so that there is a clear understanding of how this risk assessment is done, because ultimately it is now really at the level of the countries and of the governments to decide which NPOs are at risk. And here NPOs must absolutely use the opportunity to be part of this process of defining the subset So in a way, this it has been brought to another level, but it is now at the national level where the decision is taken which NPOs are considered at risk.
Thank you, Hannah. Then the follow-up question is, does the FATF know about the work of the NPO coalition sufficiently to be able to include the guidance we provide in terms of implementation of the revised recommendation 8 into the, let's say, actions of governments?
Shall I first answer and then maybe others can step in? I think the FATF Secretariat is very much aware of our NPO coalition work, and we are also in regular exchange with them. And we are also organizing follow-up events now to discuss really the implementation of the revised recommendation 8 and the interpretive note. So we've also already been in contact to clarify some of the interpretation of the wording, and I think they only welcome also input from the NPO sector that can clarify the exact wording. I would probably assume that it's difficult to now change the recommendation 8 itself if we spot something that is really unclear or should be added or changed in the recommendation, because the process is over now. There is no likelihood that this will be opened anytime soon. But I'm very sure that the FATF Secretariat will welcome kind of materials for clarification that could be also shared with the governments. So I'm positive there, but I let others of the NPO coalition also come in here.
There was a question which can be quickly answered about availability of the list of countries that will be evaluated in 2017. That list is indeed available on the FATF website. If you type in the search, let's say, window assessment calendar, and you can find the countries that will be assessed. It's also now appearing on your screen. Thank you very much. So that was a question by Alison Tilley. Now I would like to, I have two questions now for Vanya, and they concern the risk-based assessment. Let me read out the first question about the risk-based assessment. Vanya, I hope you can take these two questions.
Yes, of course.
First question is, can the NPO coalition provide some material to guide the NPO sector to conduct their own risk-based assessment?
We do have some examples, as I mentioned, Switzerland, in German. So you can find on the FATF platform website, you can find it published there and linked there. We can provide to all of those, I'm sure it's not a problem to provide links to all of those who are at the webinar or to the entire NPO coalition. We also did see reports from Indonesia about the risk assessment, and from Philippines about the risk assessment that was done jointly with the government. So there are already, and these are in English, sorry, these last two are in English. So there are examples that can be learned from. As I mentioned, we are still in the process of finding out how this actually works in practice and what are the possibilities for the quality and most effective engagement of NPOs in the risk assessment. And two different types, one that is done jointly with the government and the other that is done on their own as a shadow risk assessment. So we don't have, let's say, a guidebook yet, but hopefully if we see the need and if we gain enough knowledge and if we gain enough lessons learned from the ground, we might develop one.
And there is a follow-through question. I will read out loud. Is there a risk that even with this subset approach, non-profits that represent minority or marginalized groups or work in more sensitive areas are then even more marginalized and targeted? Might it unintentionally drive a wedge between those deemed safe and those risky and undermine a unified sector response? And how can we avoid this? Vanya, would you like?
I agree, it's a real risk, and unfortunately it will most probably happen in some countries. The only possibility is to really engage and help engage the entire sector, because this issue concerns everybody, not only human rights organizations or advocacy organizations or development organizations or those providing aid. So it really concerns everybody, and everybody can become unintentional or intentional target at some point. And really it will need an increased level of solidarity among civil society organizations on the ground.
Question which we already answered, whether the slides can be presented with the participants, and yes, we can do that. The webinar is also being recorded and can also be will also be posted on the website of the FATF Global Coalition, the FATF platform, but we can also post it on our own organization's websites. So it will be widely available. I see no more questions at the moment. I don't know if one of the presenters would like to follow through what Vanya said on the risk-based assessment, on the guidance we would like to develop as a global coalition, and then also on the potential, indeed, risk that a wedge may be driven between more mainstream organizations and organizations that are marginalized already in the country because the authorities do not like them or think they are in opposition to the authorities. I don't know whether, Hannah, you would like to say something about this, or Kate?
I think where we should put a focus on is also make sure that the NPOs understand that they need to know their laws and regulations and self-regulations very well. So even if then a subset is defined to potentially cover a certain part of the NPO sector only, there may already be laws and regulations in place that address the risk, and this is potentially likely to be the case. So I think there is an opportunity then for the NPO sector to showcase that indeed there, in the end of the day, is no risk because the risk is already addressed. And I think that's a momentum where the NPO sectors should definitely also do their homeworks in the country to discuss this in detail with their governments. Of course, sometimes it's not, well, you can be in agreement with your government about that there is no risk or the risk is already addressed by the laws, but then the FATF evaluators may take a different step when they do the evaluation of your country. So equally then in the evaluation process, it's very important for the NPO sector to showcase and illustrate that the laws are potentially in place and there's also self-regulation or good practice in place that that minimizes the risk to a minimum, that there is no need for additional measures to be put in place. And that is something that we are as NPOs just also learning how to showcase this, and we've seen this also in past evaluations that the NPO sector have been successful in also illustrating their individual country-specific context, the traditions, the legal cultures. For example, countries like Norway, which is not very, or the association sector, they're not being very regulated, but they did manage to show that the regulation that is also potentially developed by the sector itself in terms of soft law is covering the risks that are there in this sector. So I think that's an emphasis that we need to take also, to make sure that we analyze carefully what regulations and rules are already in place.
Thank you, Hannah. And I think you provided a very nice bridge to James Savage from the Front for Global Human Rights, who made a suggestion that he would like to share something on potential work the fund is doing to translate the work done at the global level on the revision of recommendation 8 to at national level. James, could I give you the mic?
James is now unmuted. He should be able to speak.
Okay, many thanks, Kay. Yes, no, just very briefly to, in the spirit of mutual learning about how we are trying to translate the fantastic improvements that have been won by the coalition on the FATF platform down at the national level. A couple of things that we're supporting and trying to do to help national level activists now apply these changes. In Nigeria, we're at a fairly advanced stage of agreeing a project to help a couple of NPOs there who are going to conduct research into restrictions around civil society space and locate the FATF evaluation that is upcoming in January, February 2017 in that context. And so we've been discussing the possibility that they will do the kind of assessment that Hannah was just talking about in terms of really knowing what the current counter-terrorist legislation, anti-money laundering legislation, and a variety of other NGO bills and a variety of other legislation already does and says in respect to possible risks and the way that the sector is regulated, as a basis for being able to A, show that where abuse is already occurring or unjustified restrictions are occurring, but as a baseline for being able to then present evidence as part of the FATF evaluation, either for the case that they are over-regulated or in trying to prevent further measures or regulations which may be unnecessary and not in proportion to risks identified, but also to help them engage in, if they can, the regional evaluators, GIABA, and the government in the process of risk assessment and evaluation. And as you said, where that's not possible, that they can conduct their own parallel sort of shadow process. So we'll see how that goes and share learning, obviously, with the community as they go through that process. We're also looking to do something similar in Mexico, although conversations are at a much earlier stage, but their evaluation is fairly early in 2017 as well. And then the other thing we're doing is hoping to commission a briefing for Ugandan activists who have, as you may be aware, have sort of just come out the other side of this process, with Uganda's evaluation having been issued in July and Uganda having been found non-compliant on recommendation 8. And what we would like to help activists there understand is, A, what does that non-compliance evaluation mean in practice? What is the possible likely response or requirement upon a state to respond to the deficiencies that were identified? And what are the risks or opportunities for civil society in sort of engaging in this sort of post-evaluation arena? Are there risks of them just ignoring it and the state therefore driving through further restrictions as it shows it's meeting deficiencies? Equally, though, are there opportunities for them to use the evaluation and the way that the deficiencies are identified to make the case that they are being over-regulated and perhaps spuriously so. So those are some of the things that we're sort of trying to do to support national level interpretation of these changes and make it useful. And as we get learning and activists we work with get learning, we'll look to share that with everybody.
Examples of how the Fund is for Global Human Rights is supporting national level work is follow-through of the work of the Global NPO Coalition. I have a question here from Haider Abdul, and I will read it. And I think this is a question for either Hannah or Vanya to address. FATF seems to have very varying levels of engagement with regional and national groups in the Global North versus the Global South. Is there an outreach strategy for FATF to engage more actively with NGOs in the Global South and make sure the influence is not driven primarily by European, US-based organizations? So I would like to invite Hannah or Vanya to... Vanya, please go ahead.
Mm-hmm. Yes, thank you. I can start with this. Yes, we noted the same thing, actually. Mm-hmm. And this was the reason why we as a global coalition strive and still try to include as many organizations from the Global South as possible. And this was also the reason why we pushed for at least an online consultation for both documents, the recommendation 8 and the interpretive note, and last year for the best practice paper, because the meetings that the FATF organizes with non-profit sector, at least so far, the last 2 meetings that were organized, they do not cover the costs. And of course, when you try to have a dialogue with the diverse sector as non-profit sector is, and you don't cover the costs for people coming in for this dialogue, of course you are immediately limiting the opportunities to participate. And at least for this latest process of a revision of recommendation 8 and interpretive note, we did manage to have the process opened up online so everybody could participate. However, I think we still need to make the point and still try to push for FATF to engage more with all organizations around the world.
Yes, and if I can add, I would like to say that it is also very important that we collaborate with the global NPO networks such as Civicus, such as Wings, to ensure that indeed through their structure also it reaches a global level. And potentially more involvement of Global South NPOs and NPO networks.
Yeah. I have a question coming from the peace building community, peace building NGOs. The question is, what room will there be for peace building NGOs? Those that focus on reconciliation efforts or engage in prevention work on the ground? Prevention also seen as an important soft measure to prevent violent extremism. This will almost always imply getting close to communities at risk. I think this is also in line with the question raised, the dilemmas raised by Kate of Norwegian Refugee Council in relation to becoming associated with terrorist groups when you operate in their neighborhood, or when you, as this person asked, Isabella asked from the peace building community, when you engage with so-called terrorists. Kate, would you like to take this question?
Sure, yes. It's an extremely good question, and it's a question which is certainly a hot topic for a lot of organizations at this time. Of course, peace-building NGOs can come under the definition of non-profit organization according to the FATF. And one thing which we are doing in NRC is looking very closely at how organizations can be impacted, and having discussions with organizations at field level to, and this might address some of the other questions I see popping up, but within the work that we're doing around the impact of counterterrorism measures on organizations, looking at what steps organizations can take to look at their own to do their own risk assessments and to improve and strengthen risk management procedures to mitigate the risk of diversion of aid to designated terrorist groups. And this may be something which could be useful in terms of falling into the category of risk as defined by FATF. But and again, I've seen it come up a few times as well. Like other organizations who are doing a lot of work on this, when we go and we discuss the impact of counterterrorism measures, part of that discussion is always FATF, and always to look at what FATF has developed, and if there's been a specific impact at the country level within which we're discussing these impacts. But in terms of the CV question in particular, just to come back to that, there's a lot of, as I say, there's a lot of discussion on this, and it's there's some studies on how this has been impacted development, peacekeeping, forgive me, peace-building organizations. But now that CV is beginning to become a more and more prevalent term, and there's more and more funding coming through those streams, I think we can expect, and we should be watching very closely in the future, all of us, on how this could impact could impact NPOs who, as you say, like whether peace building, humanitarian, or development, are by definition working in the very places where terrorist groups are operating, and thereby we are putting ourselves more at risk. So it's a topic to watch very closely, and unfortunately there's no clear, straight answer or solution yet. But I think through all the efforts that various organizations are making, including on this call, sharing information and sharing those experiences and building capacity and awareness about FATF at country level can definitely help guide us in the future.
Skates. Another question came in relation to the subset of NPOs from Gabriela Pelon. I think it's a question for Hannah or Vanya again. I will read out loud. According to Recommendation 8 and its interpretive note, countries should be ready for distinguishing NPOs, including in the FATF definition from the subset of NPOs at risk. Which could be the key steps to reach this goal?
Okay.
Hannah, would you like to take this question?
Okay, I'm not entirely sure I fully understand the question, but I'll try my best. I mean, the key steps would really be for countries to do the risk assessment and to identify which sectors potentially are at risk. So we need to ensure, of course, that countries do have enough guidance and that NPOs are also part of this process to when the governments are doing this risk assessment to define the subset of NPOs. I think we will probably need to engage closely also in developing more guidance on this. As yet, there is not a very clear guidance. I mean, FATF has already issued some recommendations of how countries should do a risk assessment, including a risk assessment of the NPO sector. We know that they do consider certain activities and certain closeness to certain parts of population or regional activities as well to be potentially risky, but it will be up to the governments to do this own assessment. And unfortunately we have seen that indeed a lot of the organizations that may then be considered at risk are the ones who are de facto also those who could potentially minimize risk because of their very specific work that they are doing on the ground. So indeed this is a little bit counterproductive, and we have to ensure that that this is taken into account also when countries do their risk assessments. So that they do not unduly restrict those organizations who are active in sensitive areas.
Maybe just to add, to what Hannah said, in addition to that, one of the key steps actually is for governments to sit down and talk to non-profit sector about the risk assessment and about the risks. And this is why we stress the engagement and the outreach to non-profit sector throughout all of the steps that come from the beginning to the end, to the implementation. We've seen in many countries non-profit organizations and the sector not even knowing that the risk assessment has been done on them. Yeah. So we have very few examples as of now where the government jointly did the risk assessment with non-profit sector and gained actually from their experience and from their knowledge and from their own measures what can be included as mitigating measures already. So it can be a win-win for everyone.
Vanya, I have a question here from, I think it's an international funder, and she's asking Robin Browning whether international funders should be evaluating NPOs differently. What else can we as international funders do to help raise awareness with our grantees without adding undue burden? Robin, could you perhaps explain what you mean by this? Because I'm not entirely clear what you mean. Yeah, Robin? Okay. Hannah, do you Would you like
no,
to?
I
Okay,
mean,
go ahead.
I was thinking probably it is what the international funders could do in terms of making sure that grantees are potentially aware and engage more. And I think indeed, yes, that is certainly a very welcome and useful exercise, because what we experience is that a lot of the NPOs still don't know about the Financial Action Task Force, and hence to raise awareness and also show them the possibilities and the opportunities that there are potentially through the FATF to start an engagement with their government, if that is possible in the given country, but really use this process, because the FATF evaluation process, the FATF, the risk assessment, all these are quite technical processes. But there is also some kind of opportunity behind this, because they are quite technical. It also gives a formalization of the process, so that indeed NPOs can ask, well, their governments, well, indeed, is this risk assessment done, and can start an engagement process potentially.
Can you hear me now? Sorry, I'm the moderator, and it seemed that I have unmuted myself. Now I think you can understand me. Thanks for that answer, Hannah. I think for Robin this has been a good answer. Otherwise, she will let us know for sure. There is another question from Victoria O'Hary from Spaces for Change in Nigeria. And her question is as follows. It does seem that states are increasingly restricting civic spaces because of pressure to comply with FATF. How can states draw a healthy balance between complying with FATF recommendations and at the same time an enabling civil society environment? Well, I think it's a key question, and I wonder who of the presenters would like to give a first reaction to the question of Victoria.
Maybe I can start, Leah. Well, I think it's actually the great question for the process. I think if we follow, if you remember the pyramid that we presented, and if you remember the 4 steps that we presented and underlying of including and engaging the nonprofit sector in all of the steps, and if the governments really look closely to follow such process of engagement and really open up to the dialogue with the sector and interpret the provisions in the recommendation aid and interpretive note restrictively in terms of restricting themselves from getting over regulatory, then they would have to come up with the enabling environment measures, right? Because the problem arises, as we've seen in practice, when first of all there is no dialogue, there is no outreach, there is no communication with the nonprofit sector about this issue. The measures are just being adopted and then implemented without anyone knowing why. And the second, when there is intentional or unintentional overregulation, and maybe the sector already has some measures in place or can be quickly put in place in order to avoid any kind of overregulation. So really the key issue here is following the right process and engaging with the nonprofit sector, I'd say, for the beginning.
Yes, and if I can add in, I think also some, I mean, the FATF evaluation process could even be also a tool to counter overregulation. And I think that is important, because with the new measure of the effectiveness checking, I think there are opportunities also to show that a government has not done any outreach. And if a government hasn't done any outreach to the NPO sector, it should be considered as non-compliant with one of the key requirements that the governments have to undertake. Second, if a country doesn't do any risk assessment and doesn't do any outreach related to the risk assessment, it's also a question of whether this government then is compliant with the recommendation and the recommendation 8 and interpretive note. So in that sense, it could even be turned into a tool to counter over-regulation. Certainly there is still some misunderstanding, and more work has to be done to educate and to inform about what recommendation 8 actually requires, because we've also seen that some countries have been arguing that some of the foreign funding restrictions are based on FATF recommendations or recommendation 8, and there is nothing in the recommendation 8 or in the other recommendations that would serve as a justification for foreign funding restrictions, as far as I'm aware, I have to add here. So I think indeed that this is something to also spread further. What is indeed required in terms of doing the right implementation and what is not required, because we've seen cases of overregulation where governments have simply used the argument of the Financial Action Task Force recommendations, and in the end of the day the regulation based on it wasn't even a proper implementation because it was overregulation.
Go ahead.
Hi. Yeah, no, I just wanted to second, I think, a very important point that Hannah made earlier, that as a very first step, we should never underestimate the level of awareness about FATF in the first place by civil society. And it can be a very technical topic to try to grasp. And first and foremost, yeah, I think it can never be highlighted enough how important it is for us to engage with people at country level to raise that awareness and to describe the process in an accessible way, and then the other steps follow suit.
Thank you, Kate. Okay, there are a few requests for the slides which we will send to the participants, but also posted on the FATF platform website, which is used by the Global NPO Coalition on the FATF to disseminate information, reach out to the NPO sector and to others that are interested. I see no other questions coming in. I also see that we have 3 minutes left. So I think we need to close this webinar. I would like to thank all of you for taking part in the webinar. Thank you so much for the very good questions. And then I would in particular like to thank Kay Guinean, Hannah Surmats, Kate McGrain, Vanya Skoric for the excellent presentations and for feeding back to the questions of the listeners, of the participants. And also a special thanks to Andrea Hall for taking care of all the technical stuff, which is very important when one organizes a webinar. So I'm closing the webinar now, and you'll hear from us in the near future. And for any updates, please do visit the www.fatfplatform.org. Thank you very much.